Bosh Kawalik, I'm Frank Blanquette. Welcome to FNX Now. Across many southern states, there are tribes and tribal communities who are split between the U.S. and Mexican border. This includes federally recognized tribes like the Kumeyaay, Kickapoo, Tohono O'otom, and Yaqui, who have had long-standing immigration issues pertaining to community members of Mexican nationality. The Trump administration, which ran a successful presidential campaign on an anti-illegal immigrant platform, shifted some of these efforts to target legal immigrants, specifically from south of the U.S. border. This episode of FNX Now, produced in partnership with Ethnic Media Services, explores some of these policies which target Latin American, Asian, and other non-white minority immigrants. Let's go to our moderator, Sunita Sarabji, for more. Sunita?
Thank you for joining us yet again. Great to see all of you all. I would like to first introduce Sarah Pierce, a policy analyst at the Migration Policy Institute, which last week released a report of the 400 changes to immigration policy since the advent of the Trump administration. Welcome, Sarah.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate this opportunity. This report is essentially a catalog of the 400 plus changes the administration has made to immigration during their time in office. We started to keep this list internally at the beginning of the administration because they were making changes at such a rapid fire pace, and some of them were very small and very technical. And this list inside MPI ended up being a really helpful resource. So we decided to publish it and to put it out there so it can be a resource for everyone else. And one of the benefits of having all of these changes, kind of tightly packed into the pages of this report is it helps you see some of the trends with this administration's agenda on immigration. For example, many of the changes reflect the administration's really strong knowledge of immigration law and regulations and their willingness to enforce things that have been on the books for years but never been implemented. One example of this is they've put into force a 1996 law that has allowed ICE to begin levying fees of up to $799 per day for unauthorized immigrants who remain in the country in violation of a removal order. So it seems like a really small and technical changes, but when you take these all together, it has added up to a really monumental change and evolution of our immigration system. One example of a technical change they made that has actually has potential to be alone, make very big changes to the system is public charge. This has gotten a lot of news, so you may have heard of it, but it's a restriction that's been on the books since the very beginnings of our immigration system, but really rarely implemented. In public charge restricts individuals from coming into the United States if the government determines that that individual is likely to be reliant on public benefits when they get to the country. And the Trump administration has really expanded the definition of who would fall under this restriction. Its implementation has been rocky due to legal setbacks, but once implemented and really enforced, it could significantly change the flows into the United States, disfavoring women, the elderly, and nationals of Central America and Mexico. So overall, looking at this report, the really broad changes that have been implemented by the administration would include closing off humanitarian benefits, sealing the southern border, making life in the interior really uncomfortable for immigrants, both legal and unauthorized immigrants inside the United States, and reducing legal immigration into the country. And the pandemic has only accelerated the changes that this administration has made. I'd say there are 3 changes that have really been kind of the biggest that this administration has made during the pandemic. The first is a CDC order. The second would be the April 22nd presidential proclamation restricting immigration, permanent immigration into the country, and then the June 22nd proclamation restricting temporary workers. So I'll talk for the rest of my time about each of those and the implications for those. So the CDC order is another great example of this administration diving into the laws on the books and finding things that have never been enforced before, but can be used to really restrict immigration into the country. There was a 1944 law that allows the Surgeon General to restrict the entry of individuals deemed a public health threat. So the administration used that law to and issued an order coming from the CDC director that restricts the entry of individuals that are not authorized to enter the country. The effect of that has been essentially ending asylum at the southern border. And that's actually something the administration has been working on for years. We have many, many policies that have come down over the prior 3 years that really restrict asylum at the southern border with the goal of really just having no one enter there. But in one movement with the CDC order, they've really accomplished that goal. As a result of this order, asylum seekers, the vast majority of them, are being expelled from the southern border. We don't know a lot, unfortunately, about the procedures under which they're being expelled, and there are a few who are still being let into the country to, in theory, apply for asylum, and we don't know a lot about who's chosen and why, unfortunately. But in all, that CDC order has really completely dismantled asylum at the southern border. So the second big change that I referenced was the April 22nd proclamation. This proclamation is interesting because the president issued it not justifying this major immigration change with the public health crisis, but rather with the economic crisis, saying that he is restricting permanent immigration into the country in order to protect US nationals on the job market and in the economy. What that April 22nd proclamation does is end immigration into the country in several categories, many family-based categories, including, for example, parents of US citizens, siblings of US citizens, spouses and children of legal permanent residents. But it also restricts the entry of anyone applying from outside of the country for the diversity visa lottery. And the effect of that proclamation actually accomplishes something that the administration previously tried to push Congress to do, which was they tried to get Congress several times to end the diversity visa lottery and to significantly reduce family-based migration, which they have labeled chain migration. So in one move, under the opening given to them by the pandemic, they've accomplished something on immigration that previously all of us would have thought they would need congressional cooperation to do. Then last, there's that June 22nd proclamation, which significantly, which restricts temporary workers coming into the country in major non-immigrant categories. The H-1B visa is the most common visa for skilled workers coming into the country. That has been restricted. They've also restricted J's, L's, and H-2Bs, which are a little more niche, but still major categories for temporary workers coming into the United States. Now, anyone applying for those to come into the United States on those categories, if they're applying from outside of the country, they're restricted from doing so. And this, again, like the other provisions, accomplishes something the administration was already working towards prior to the pandemic. They had significantly increased scrutiny of applications of temporary workers, especially the H-1B visa. And now with this one movement, they've significantly reduced that flow. And then I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the fact that we still have travel bans in place for foreign nationals traveling from 31 countries. And as with many of these procedures, it's kind of hard to see an end in sight, not only because the pandemic is still raging in the United States, it's still a very present problem, but also because these provisions accomplish things on immigration that the administration was working towards for a long time, for years before. It's hard to imagine them walking these back willingly, even once the pandemic is no longer a prevalent issue. So I think that was somewhere around 10 minutes, but just in either way, I'll just stop and take questions from there.
To what extent has the administration been able to implement that $799 per day charge to undocumented immigrants? And then what kinds of characteristics are they using to deny entry to asylum seekers at the southern border?
So first, for the ICE fee levying, one thing that has been actually nice under this administration is they've actually been quite transparent with a lot of data, but that is one thing that we do not have data on. We don't know how widely that provision is being implemented. We don't know how many immigrants are receiving these exorbitant fines. And then with the second question on the southern border, so we don't have transparency from the administration on how exactly they're implementing the CDC's order at the southern border. We do have leaked instruction to CBP officers that show no consideration for people who are interested in applying for asylum. Instead, if migrants who are apprehended in between ports of entry or who approach ports of entry without authorization to enter the country, if they proactively say that they have a fear of torture in their home country, not a fear of persecution, just a fear of torture, then they may have a chance of applying for humanitarian benefits in the United States. We know that there are a few people that are still being permitted to apply for asylum, but we don't know why. We don't know who these few people are, or why the administration is not applying the CDC order to them.
Henrietta Burrows asked the question that I think so many of us are wondering about. Henrietta?
Thank you, Sunita. Sarah, you said that it would be difficult for the administration to walk back the restrictions it's imposed even after the pandemic. But what if someone else is elected and there is another administration? Could these restrictions then be walked back?
Unfortunately, no, these can't be walked back by a future administration. And nearly every change under President Trump has been issued by executive fiat, right? It's been an administrative change. It hasn't gone through Congress, which does make it simpler for a future, more immigrant-friendly administration to reverse them. But the reality is that they were done at a very rapid-fire pace, and no Democratic administration would have the time or resources or political willingness to spend this much time on immigration, undoing each of these changes. Not only is it just a reality that we have a lot of other priorities center front for the US government, but also Democrats have not been very active or interested in acting on immigration. They have been very quick to say that they want to undo what President Trump has done, but they haven't really put forward a vision for what that immigration system should look like. So I think that there's just a lack of willingness there to undo each of these changes. And then also, a lot of them shouldn't be quickly undone. For example, all of the changes at the southern border, the president really has accomplished a great reduction in the number of unauthorized arrivals at the southern border. If you quickly undid those, you probably would see surging arrivals at the southern border. And the system we had in place before President Trump took office, it was a very, very imperfect system. So ideally, you'd want an administration that not only was willing to invest in undoing Trump's actions, but also who would be thoughtful about it and implements, ideally, a better system on the other side. And I don't know, considering all else that's going on in the United States right now with the pandemic, the economic crisis, the public health crisis, the problems with health insurance, the national conversation on racial injustice, it's hard for me to picture a future administration really investing this much in immigration.
Sarah, one last question from Frank Blanquette.
Thank you, Sunita. Are there examples that pinpoint race-based immigration attacks on Latin American, Asian, and other non-white asylum seekers or immigrants versus white European or Anglo-immigrants, like Russian immigrants, for example? And are there any biases or accommodations being made to favor one racial group over another?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the public charge regulation that I mentioned earlier is a really good example of that. My colleagues wrote a great piece that shows what groups would be favored over others, and certainly immigrants from Latin America, immigrants from Africa, and immigrants from Asia would not be favored under the public charge regulation. So that immediately is a great one to point to. I'd also look at MPI's website. We created a data tool back when Congress was considering legislation on DACA, and the administration asked Congress during these negotiations to restrict certain green card categories that coincidentally have now been restricted under the president's proclamation, and certain green card categories favor immigrants from certain areas of the country. So this data tool that my colleagues created, you can look at that and you can, kind of go in and manually restrict those flows yourself, and you can see where in the world those flows would be restricted from. So just off the top of my head, those are two: public charge and then their interest in eliminating certain green card categories.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. We move on to Kalpana Petibodla, who is founder and partner of the Matthews Petibodla Law Group. Kalpana?
Thanks so much, Sunita, and thanks for allowing me to share some remarks with your listeners. I think, though, before we jump into these proclamations, these recent presidential proclamations, we should have a context in which they arose. The president had initially took office on a claim that he was going to stop largely the unauthorized entrance of immigrants or the undocumented population. But very shortly after taking office, he actually attacked specifically legal immigration, and he did so to the business community through his order called Buy American, Hire American policy. That came out in April 2017, just a few months after taking office. What that's resulted in my experience as a business immigration practitioner, this has included, for example, just making it harder for companies to sponsor foreign workers by increasing the numbers of requests for evidence for documents in long boilerplate templated requests. This has gone up 3 times the amount that by prior administrations, by suspending something called premium processing that allows employers to quickly be able to make an offer to a potential employee and then process their immigration paperwork within a matter of a couple of weeks. But with multiple suspensions of premium processing, those have taken months, and it's become difficult for the movement of labor, which is critical to the success of business and our economy. From removing the deference in prior approvals, meaning where a company had somebody that they have sponsored in the past and then wanted to seek an extension of their work visa, those cases are now reviewed anew, and all of the prior documentation that they have previously provided is now ignored, to requiring interviews for employment-based green card holders, green card applicants, under the guise of protecting our national security. Having gone to numerous of those interviews, I have yet to see how national security is even raised in a single one of those interviews, and it has become actually creating a backlog in overall immigration handling. So now coming back to where we are, the proclamations post-COVID-19 are essentially a sledgehammer to business immigration. As Sarah's already outlined, those 2 orders, the April 22nd and the 24th, I'll focus on the June 24th order rather. So how did the president do this? I think that's one question we've got to ask ourselves. How was the president able to do this? He did so under Section 212F of the Immigration and Nationality Act, which permits the president to bar immigrants if he finds, and this is important, if he finds that it is in our national interest. So that implicit in that section that gives the president these powers is the notion that the president has to make a finding. And in the past, our courts have been hands off of the president's powers because they're usually rooted in national security interests as opposed to a domestic economic policy. And that's what he's done here. He's testing these waters where he's claiming, I've got the right to bar immigrants because it's in our national interest, because it's against our it harms our economy. And study after study by economists have shown that immigrants do not harm our economy and, in fact, grow our economy and have multiple spillover impacts into the local economy. So I think it's critical here that we don't fall into this trap in believing that the president can do anything by proclamation just because he claims this notion of a national interest. And, in fact, I'd like to go into those economics really quickly, if I may. First, the math itself doesn't add up. Okay, so the president argued, as well as his surrogates have stated, that over 525,000 U.S. jobs would be protected by the actions he has taken. And as Sarah's organization has rightly pointed out, they've maybe blocked about 167,000 people, because all of these bars relate to people who are outside of the United States, not in the United States. And there's just not that many people that would have been impacted by the bar. So there's not 525,000 jobs that are being protected. And also we'll talk about the fallacy regarding this one-for-one replacement in jobs in a moment. I'd like to get back to the question from the earlier caller about these studies that show that immigrants indeed help grow our economy. First off, there's innovation. Okay, foreign workers in STEM fields are critical to the innovation in the growth of patents. This is acknowledged by the Department of Homeland Security itself. Okay, so the administration, the Department of Homeland Security acknowledged in its own reports when it wanted to seek extensions of OPTs that foreign workers help stimulate innovation. This was also argued by the Cato Institute in their study recently in May 2020, and as recently as the Department of Homeland Security's move to increase immigration filing fees. They specifically state, and I'll quote it here, "We recognize that immigrants and international students make significant contributions to the U.S. technology industry." That was just 2 weeks ago. Then there's entrepreneurship, okay? Immigrants are twice as likely to start businesses than U.S.-born natives. And so that is important. That's critical to our recovery. And third, there's the job multiplier effect. And as I was telling Sarah, I was on the phone with our good friend, Professor Perry from UC Davis with the Global Migration Institute this morning. And he has done independent studies, nonpartisan studies about the job multiplier effect of certain workers, including the H-2Bs, which are blocked by the Proclamation, as well as H-1Bs. And a study by the American Enterprise Institute for Public Policy Research gave a good example. For every 100 H-1B workers, it results in an additional 183 jobs for U.S. natives. For every 100 H-2B workers, it results in an additional 464 jobs for U.S. natives. So I think this is super important to understand the job multiplier effect and to debunk this notion, it's called the lump of labor fallacy. This has existed well before this administration, going back to a study, I think, I don't want to be wrong about the dates, but I think in the 80s or 90s by Paul Krugman. And what that is this notion that there's somehow a zero-sum game for like one person's job being displaced by a foreign worker. And in fact, a Senate report in 2000, the year 2000, when they were relooking at the H-1B program, stated, we understand there may be abuses to the H-1B program. That's there. That may be a possibility. But it's a myth that there's a fixed number of jobs for which competition is a zero-sum game. And I think this is super critical. People focus sometimes on these highlights, these news programs about the abuses, but when you look at the overall effect, Professor Perry says the overall ripple effect is there's actually job creation, and our economy does better with the immigrants. In particular, the high-skilled workers in H-1B programs tend to be part of that job creation process. I also want to mention, hey, there's been, I understand there has been unemployment, high unemployment rates since COVID-19, but the reality is that it has not been in the STEM fields. So in January, we were unprecedented low rates of unemployment in the STEM fields of 3%. Just after the pandemic, and as early as in studies from May of this year, those rates are at 2.5%, because these are the critical workers. They're the workers, frankly, they're the workers that are allowing us to have the Zoom call right now, right? They're the ones that we need to allow us to get back on our feet and be able to work remotely and provide the technologies that we all need. So, and then finally, I do want to acknowledge that some of the immigrants that were barred based upon these economic justifications, as Sarah pointed out, involved our family preference categories. So they were our aging parents, the siblings of U.S. citizens who waited decades. If you're from the Philippines, they waited 20 years. They are not direct competitors by any measure in the U.S. job market, right? Our 70-plus-year-old parents were not coming here to steal jobs from Americans. And in order to get to this point, as Sarah mentioned, they already had to go through this in-depth documentation that they will not be a public charge to the United States. And so this idea, which was the first proclamation, they were kind of easy picking, if you will, because if you remember, everybody remembers, on April 20th, President Trump first said, I'm going to bar immigrants to the United States. Within 2 days, he couldn't get there, so he instead went after a vulnerable population, which is our aging parents and our siblings outside of the United States. And so that was easy, so nobody can easily, would immediately be upset about it. But obviously, they're not the folks that are going to come here and steal these jobs that the proclamation is stating. And so, in conclusion on that, the proclamation appears to be really a quick fix to an economic crisis, but I think it's largely geared towards a political agenda. And that's exactly what the two lawsuits that have already been filed challenging the proclamation state. And these were brought by a variety of groups. The first lawsuit included individuals and civil rights organizations, and the second lawsuit included major manufacturing and business organizations. I mean, it's the National Association of Manufacturers, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, that's stating to our president and to our country that by barring these immigrants, we are not saving jobs and we're having the actual opposite effect.
Kalpana, there's a question for you, and I think we'll end on this note, but it's an important question, I think. But I'm going to ask Amar Gupta to ask his question.
So my question is, can you elaborate more on the H-1B issue? How do you think it will hurt the tech industry, particularly in the Silicon Valley?
So there is significant potential impacts, but there's concerns regarding the impacts on innovation, on the manner in which H-1B workers and other sort of high-tech workers are what we call job multipliers, so that they can help grow the local economy. They can help companies reach certain goals that they have in growth. So yes, there's going to be significant impacts.
Thank you so much, Kalpana. Thank you all.
Thank you, Sunita, and that is all the time that we have today. Thank you to Ethnic Media Services and to all our panelists. For FNX Now, I'm Frank Blanquette. Dios Boatik. Thank you for watching.